Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Carrie Anderson, production editor at TNSR. This episode features a presentation by Susan Colbourn and Simon Miles from the Clements Center's Summer Seminar in History and Statecraft. Using the example of the war in Ukraine, they discuss how we understand and analyze the world around us.
We've kind of introduced ourselves, but one of my favorite things about teaching history in a policy school is that we get the opportunity to introduce history. By and large, I don't teach history majors at Duke. I have some, very few. I think that's true for you as well. And one of my favorite things to do is to take an engineering student or an economics student or even a particularly positive-minded political science student and an intrepid political science student and introduce them to what history is as I understand it. And I've got my definition. My definition is basically that history is an attempt to impose a logic or a structure on a kind of infinitely vast and sometimes infinitely chaotic past. That is to say, there's an element of the artificial in history, I think, and there's an element of the kind of analytical in history, not just rote. But this is a really fun thing to do in a policy school, is to be able to actually start and define the basic principles.
You know, one of the things I always talk about with my students is that we all do history, right? Each and every single one of us is a historian, whether we intend to be or not, whether we do so consciously or not. Right? We use the various bits and pieces of the historian's toolkit in our everyday lives and situations all the time. We prioritize or place greater weight on some facts or events over others. We craft narratives to beat the uncertain, unruly, and chaotic elements of the world around us, whether that's past or present, into more accessible, easily understood, and digestible packages. Often in doing so, we try to instrumentalize what we know about the past to give us bearings or orient us in the complex and confusing world. So it's sort of there that I want to use as our jumping off point. And I think we'll talk about three things and then some closing remarks picking up on Steve's comments about disciplines and accountability and some of those points. So first, we'll talk a bit about how history, historical interpretation, and historical narratives are at play in the war in Ukraine. Second, we'll talk about how the war in Ukraine fits within and tests major subjects and debates in the academic study of international politics. And they're unconsciously not defining it as history, right? Paul flagged that I have a degree in the history of modern international relations. Yeah, I'm Canadian. So we don't believe that international relations is a subset of political science. We believe international relations as a field is methodologically pluralistic. Area studies, economics, history, and political science, languages, culture, and more. And then the third thing we'll talk about is to reflect on some of our own experiences to talk about how we might use or have used history to understand current policy challenges. So more of the theoretical history and policy stuff with Ukraine as our the grist for the mill.
Yeah. And, you know, when we agreed on this topic, I was very happy because they're sort of tailor-made for one another, history and the war in Ukraine, because in so many ways, both the causes and the conduct of the war, I mean, this is a history war. Right? This is a war about history, about dueling, sometimes, wildly divergent understandings of the past. It's a war, I think, about some of that personal history, that lived history that Susie was talking about. I don't think that you can understand what's going on in Ukraine if you don't understand how Vladimir Putin views history, whether that's his deeply warped understandings of history that anyone who watched that Tucker Carlson interview were treated to, where he said, let me just talk for 30 seconds to a minute about history. And then you get, I think, close to 3/4 of an hour of deeply, deeply weird interpretations of the past, all kind of mobilized, weaponized for that. I think you have to understand, for example, Vladimir Putin's presence at the end of the Cold War, right? Not only his sense of the decline and collapse of the Soviet Union, falling victim to what he writes, well, he doesn't really write these, but what is written in his memoirs for him, First Person, the book is called First Person, that this is a terminal disease without a cure, a paralysis of power. And he certainly has been very focused on that kind of power vertical. I think you have to understand his experience being in East Germany for the end of the Cold War, watching what was arguably one of the most sophisticated police states that we've ever seen. Even that could not survive a popular uprising. And if you think how Vladimir Putin views his personal security and the stability of his regime is divorced from him watching a country which at the end there had about 2.5% of the entire population as secret informants. So pervasive, so deep was the Stasi's intelligence penetration of their main target, which was their own society. If you think that doesn't inform how he runs Russia, I think you're ignoring a hugely powerful explanatory variable there. And that's why he's so obsessed with public opinion and information on domestic and elite affairs.
I think you can also see history playing out in the ongoing debate, much of it very public, over the origins and causes of the war, right? Which continues to shape recommendations about what to do next or what the right or best policy option may be. And so these debates, it seems to me, are defined in large part by distinct and competing narratives about the history of international politics and how they have unfolded since 1989. Here, I'm thinking of popular arguments and disagreements about the role of NATO, its continuation after the Cold War, and its enlargement to include former members of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union proper. Or the recurring argument that there was somehow a missed opportunity to achieve a democratic, prosperous Russian Federation if only we had done more or given more aid or patted Boris Yeltsin on the back in exactly the right place. And there are, of course, those who push back on that argument, pointing to the very real record of Russian behavior and foreign policy choices in even the sort of lauded heydays of the early 1990s. We might think of the alternative histories verging on wish casting about the prospect of a nuclear-armed Ukraine that had not given up its inheritance from the Soviet Union, right? Something that even Bill Clinton has dabbled in with a little bit of remorse about how events have unfolded since his time in the White House. And for us as scholars, I think there are some interesting methodological questions here that I'll come back to in a few minutes.
But we have to deal with this challenge of, we're all trained to assemble facts in whatever way, we do it methodologically, however it may be. We're trained to assemble facts, but we need to remember that human beings, and we probably all do actually do this in our private lives, often assemble fictions. We assemble misremembered events. We assemble rose-tinted versions of what Russia was in the 1990s, as if the Yeltsin regime, which the sort of the fantasy Russia school of thought holds, would have definitely moved on a totally different trajectory, as if they hadn't been backing Slobodan Milosevic's genocidal regime in Yugoslavia, as if they hadn't carried out their own brutal war in Chechnya during these years. These are so easy to sweep under the rug in the name of a really tight, straightforward historical narrative.
I think the other way that the war in Ukraine can be instructive for us thinking about international politics is that for those of us interested in understanding the dynamics of international politics, The war in Ukraine is also a prime example, or maybe even a case study, a laboratory, take your word of choice, of big picture concepts and theoretical debates that are foundational to much of what we all study and work on. I want to toss a few out, but I think there are doubtless many more that we might come up with that I hope we'll talk about in our Q&A. So I'll flag 4. First, what constitutes escalation and how does escalation actually work in international politics, right? What is escalatory? Where does the escalation ladder, where does escalation start? What is the point zero? Second, what role do nuclear weapons play in the conduct of war, be it the prospect of use, public threats of use, or more? Third, how effective are alliances, and NATO in particular, for providing security? And fourth, how does strategic culture change and why? And on that fourth question, I would say the obvious example to look at is Ukraine's strategic culture. But I would also point to Germany's and the post-February 2022 phenomenon, both real and imagined, of the Zeitenwende as another place where there's interesting evidence. But I think in listing these out, for me, I'm left with the $64,000 question. How are we making sense of what's unfolding in front of us? Are we using it to generate new questions, to reconsider our existing theories, assumptions, ideas, worldview? Or are we confirming our priors, wielding the latest news story or push alert as evidence that, of course, we were right all along?
And I think both of us, our views on this are on the record, and neither of us is shy about this. But this is always the challenge, right? To analyze from a position of impartiality to the greatest extent that human beings can actually achieve that, at the same time as you view the outcome of the phenomenon that you are analyzing with an extraordinary degree of partiality. And so for those of us who are kind of in the business of teaching history to non-history majors, again, who will mostly not take a lot of other history courses, who, if they take more history courses, will probably take it with the other person who's sitting at this table. This is a challenge because there's this temptation, I think, to just treat history as this kind of lesson factory, right? If we can just find the right lesson, then we can unlock whatever the problem set with which we're confronted is. And the challenge is just finding that right lesson. I don't believe that. I try to tell my students what I'm trying to teach you is a historical mindset, which is kind of more about patterns of behavior and patterns of thought than it is really about building this Rolodex of facts that you can find, deploy, and maybe even weaponize, if you're feeling sporty, against whatever it is that confronts you. And we thought we would talk through a few of these because the notion of kind of history and policy, applied history, whatever you want to call it, I think can often be really nebulous. And it's worth actually talking about what we're talking about when we talk about this issue. And so one of the big ones to me is appreciating the probability of consequences that are low probability, low likelihood, but high impact. And so in the case of Ukraine, my mind always goes to, those first few days, especially the Russian attack on Hostomel Airport, the Antonov airfield, just north of Kyiv, which was, we know, if we know our military history, was a fairly long-reach, unsupported air assault operation, which was then bolstered by a fairly long-reach, unsupported airborne operation. If you put those two together, you do not get high probability of success, to put it very, very mildly. And yet that was a close-run thing. And I think if that one little location had turned out differently, and the high-risk gamble of a sort of strategic bridgehead almost, and a strategic airlift bridgehead on the Kyiv Ring Road had been realized, we would be having a very different conversation about the war in Ukraine. Instead, we had this great conversation about the heroic defense of Kyiv and reckless Russian behaviors. But then on this theme of unintended consequences, that gins up expectations for future Ukrainian military performance on the offensive, which are, frankly, untenable. I think it's so important to acknowledge the importance of perspective and have some humility about that. Invading Ukraine didn't have to make sense to Simon Miles. And it fundamentally didn't make sense to me, even though I thought it was coming, right up until I woke up in Bucharest, Romania in February 2024 in 2022 to learn that there was a war going on next door. It had to make sense to Vladimir Putin. And so in the spirit of accountability, right, I was actually tactically and operationally, I was basically right about what the Russians were going to do, because that was the smartest thing to do with the force that they had on the borders. I was totally wrong strategically, because there was a totally unbalanceable equation between how small their force was and how big the enemy that they were trying to attack was. It didn't make sense to me that you would try to effectively achieve regime change with such a light footprint. But that is what happened. Why? Because I didn't see the world, for better or for worse, from Vladimir Putin's perspective. I didn't have probably an enormous wealth of pretty shoddy information from the FSB about how receptive the Ukrainian elites and public would be to that. I didn't have a lot of misreported information about how these units, which I've been told are at kind of like 80% strength, are actually at half that, sometimes even less. To me, this sort of historical enterprise here is embracing things like multi-causal explanations. We joked a little bit yesterday about, how could NATO have done this? Well, no, it's not. You can't explain all of this just because NATO expanded. You can't explain all of this just because Vladimir Putin's brother died in the siege of Leningrad. You've got to kind of put it all together to construct that analytical edifice. I think a lot also about focusing on discontinuity, not just continuity. Our minds, I think, like continuity. We like straight lines. But it's not, for example, inevitable to me that the Russian defense industrial base can keep going on indefinitely. Nor is it inevitable that the Putin regime keeps going on indefinitely in and of itself, or feels that it can, or feels self-confident enough to behave that way. It was interesting this year, the very beginning of this year, when the price of eggs went up very significantly in the Russian Federation, almost doubled. I think the number is just shy of double. And this was a function of various factors that were precipitated by the war that ranged from imports of things like pesticides and veterinary medicines getting a lot more expensive and hard to do. It was a function of workers in the civilian sector moving out into the defense sector, lured by much more attractive wages, building shells rather than, shoveling chicken shit, for which we can't really blame them. Even though shell manufacturing is actually a pretty risky proposition still in the year 2024. But I thought it got a really interesting result, which is that the Kremlin was much more receptive to economically motivated frustration and protest, and actually tried to meet those people with their grievances, not in the middle, but certainly was much more open to this being a conversation than, for example, they have been about purely political protest. So when I think about what this war is doing to the Russian economy, I don't assume that it just can keep going on in a straight line inevitably, because economies and societies are intrinsically linked. It's also really important to me to think about proportionality and how important facts actually are. So right now, the story of the war in Ukraine is the story of, what's going on the Flot, what's going on kind of right there kinetically in the space. And I understand why that is. But I also wonder, like, what happens if we're here in Beaver Creek, Colorado, 50 years later, and we are doing, as Susie said, the war in Ukraine as a case study in international politics, now squarely in the past tense? Are the us's of that conversation going to be talking about the battlefield toing and froing? Or are they going to talk about defense industrial based stuff? Are they going to talk about the attempted assassination of Armin Paperger, the Rheinmetall CEO, as just the first little glimpse of what would become a huge sort of political, covert, clandestine activity warfare campaign between the two countries, which maybe won't even be resolved in 50 years from now? Are they going to be talking about the drone factory out in Alabuga? Out on the Russian steppe, where Iranian tech and Chinese components are assembled by African workers for use by Russian soldiers, as kind of the first little glimpse we got of some kind of nexus of states that would preoccupy American foreign policy for ever so long. Those are just some thoughts. I think we ought to be humble about how little we actually know. And certainly when it comes to the tactical, technical details on the battlefield, those are, in the Ukrainian case particularly, very sensibly not public information. But even just about what actually matters.
Yeah, I think for me, in adding to Simon's list, that would be the place I would start, is that the fundamental first principles thing that I take from my historical training into any time I talk about current events, whether it is about the war in Ukraine, whether it's about the health and vitality or lack thereof of the transatlantic relationship, whether it is, should we do another INF deployment because it worked so well the last time and we'll get another INF treaty. Don't do that. The analogy is not a good one.
But not all analogies are bad, right? I feel like we get professionally kind of indoctrinated into this, like, analogy is bad. And obviously some analogies are really bad. For example, I really don't like the new Cold War analogy or Cold War 2.0 analogy. I think that leaves out an ideological component to the contest of the latter half of the 20th century that was present in Moscow then, is not, I think, a positive ideological component. I don't use the term positive normatively here, right? That is not present in Moscow today. That is to say, Vladimir Putin is not going around and saying, here's a better way to run your system. Rather, he's saying, here's a better way to enrich yourself from your system, and we can kind of work around the parameters. But some analogies are good, right? When Niels Bohr discovered the atom, he used the analogy of the solar system because we all understood it intuitively, and he could convey the power of his idea that way.
Yeah, so I think for me, a big part of it is starting at the first principles place, right? And asking what seems like an obvious question, but is one that many people find it hard to answer. How do we know? How do we really know what we think we know, right? So you can use your Rumsfeldian taxonomy. You can think about where your sources emanate from, about reporting bias, about coverage bias, about all of these things. But how do we know what we think we know? Another major methodological piece of the toolkit for me is about how you frame the problem or define your subject. So if, for instance, we frame the history of NATO enlargement in the 1990s as primarily a problem set or an issue to be understood in the context of US-Russian relations, by no means an unpopular way to see it in the literature on the 1990s we have. What are the limits of that approach? How else might we frame or understand the issue? How are we narrowing or distorting or shaping not just the atmosphere in our scholarly debates, but in the public imagination about how we understand and conceptualize NATO enlargement? So if you frame the history of NATO enlargement as a US-Russian issue, what assumptions are implicit there? Who gets to have agency and who is excluded? You might be forgiven for coming to the conclusion that the United States is the sole actor within NATO to have any agency. You might come to the conclusion that the United States was the driving force, the sometimes sole driving force behind NATO's enlargement. You might be tempted to cast existing traditional old allies in pretty stereotypically defined popular roles. The French as spoiler, the Germans as confused, with staunch partners like Volker-Ruhe on one hand, but mostly dominated by a reluctant, risk-averse political class. And the outlooks, objectives, and priorities of those seeking membership, your Polands, Czech Republics, Hungaries, and the like, might not feature so prominently in the story you tell if you frame it as one of US-Russian relations. I'll give one other example, an illustration of how aperture or perspective matters, right? We could look at the July 8th strike the Russians conducted against a children's hospital in Kyiv. And the news stories we see, right, the push alerts we get are rightly appalled, outraged, right? It produces gruesome images. It's shocking, viscerally shocking and upsetting. But if you think about Russian foreign policy, or you know your history of Russian engagement in the world over the last 10 years, right, it's consistent with how the Russians and Syrians waged much of the Syrian civil war, right? And so public analysts and think tanks have chronicled over 400 such attacks that Russian or Syrian forces conducted against hospital or medical infrastructure in the Syrian war, right? So one place where Steve's reminder earlier that areas don't exist in total separation from one another, right? Looking at Russian conduct, the Russian intervention in Syria can help us see a different trajectory or contextualize or understand Russian behavior in Ukraine. The other thing I want to flag is understanding how history in the areas you work on is being used, right? So one of the big trends at NATO right now is to talk about the need to relearn deterrence. That's a fundamentally historical exercise, right? There is an assumption there about the history of NATO as an organization, as a bureaucracy, that NATO used to know how to do deterrence during the Cold War, and that NATO lost that knowledge, right? Whether that was in generational change, in distraction, in other things, out of area problems, Afghanistan, right? The stories of and campaigns that occupied so much NATO attention in the 1990s, 2000s, and beyond, right? So there is a demand. There's an audience out there interested in understanding and drawing lessons from the past, particularly from the history of the Cold War. And they are going to do it whether you as a historian want to be part of that conversation or not, right? And that is fundamentally a personal choice, and we can come back to talking about that. But I think that's one piece for me. And then the last thing I want to foot stomp, Simon already mentioned it, but I think it's the most important, and it's the sort of top line, bottom line, bluff point I always make with my students, which is that the most important thing I want you to come away with from a class with me is about humility, right? To be able to identify and admit the things we don't yet know or might never know, and not to succumb to the temptation to try and hide those in your teaching, your writing, or any engagement that you do, but to embrace the uncertainty, right? It's an integral part of the world in which we are thinking and writing. And if we want to influence conversations, whether it's thinking about our students as voters, as citizens, as future policymakers, whether you want to speak to current policymakers, I personally prioritize a lot being brave enough to say, I don't know. I can't know that. And I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear just so that you invite me back.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.